I've always wondered, what would happen if the 1980s stars of the WWE hopped into Dr. Emmett Brown's DeLorean, let that baby hit 88 miles per hour, and traveled 30 or so years into the future, arriving on the contemporary wrestling scene as fresh-faced rookies having to prove themselves all over again? Which stars would get the rub of the green, grab the wrestling equivalent of Biff's almanac, and fire their way to the top of the industry? And which stars would make like a tree and leave? Luckily for me and you, I recently fell and hit my head off my toilet seat, momentarily glimpsing into the time-space continuum and setting my eyes on an out-of-this-world scientific formula that answers this very conundrum with delightful accuracy. For the good of all that we know, I cannot share with you the details of my formula, but I can let you know this: the modern world of pro wrestling is no place for the slow and lumbersome big men like Typhoon or the over-the-top cartoon characters like Hulk Hogan. I'm Adam Pachisi from Cultaholic.com, and these are 10 80s WWE stars who would be huge today. Fact: I have a formula, remember? Join us! Number 10, The Rockers. We've all heard Shawn Michaels, Marty Jannetty, and the WWE say it before, but I'm going to say it again. The Rockers were before their time. As one of the many teams changing the wrestling landscape in the 80s, Michaels and Jannetty's youthful exuberance was an instant crowd pleaser, especially to those who favored young men donning mullets and abs. But it was how they used this to their favor within the formulas of their matches that makes them so perfect as a crossover act to the modern day. The Rockers were fast and athletic, but their work was also pierced with the old-school wrestling storytelling mentalities of the 80s, making them a tag team that could transition into the modern wrestling landscape in any environment. Whether it be in the WWE opposite the likes of the Usos and the New Day, or on the Indies against the likes of the Young Bucks. They might need to be heels of some kind, because that sort of hand-clapping, always smiling good guy doesn't get over as much in the modern era, but are you telling me that Shawn Michaels wouldn't be able to pull off a tweener like Jason Jordan, or an out-and-out smarmy heel like, well, Shawn Michaels? They'd probably need a makeover just to get down the street without people laughing at their mullet perms, but they'd sure be a huge presence in the current wrestling scene. And I'm willing to bet that the barbershop window betrayal would still be just as effective today. Number 9, Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig, was exactly what his gimmick implied: perfect. As an in-ring technician, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single wrestler from the 80s who could touch him as an across-the-board talent, and his gimmick was one that was easy to digest and understand as just about anybody's. He was never a world champion during his prime, though he was the workhorse champion, the intercontinental champion, numerous times, and was given main event status by retiring Ric Flair in the early 90s. Even so, given the evolution of wrestling in the modern day towards smaller, more technically gifted wrestlers, it does seem like Hennig would be utilized as even more of an important player in the current market, drafting a slot for himself similar to that of Kurt Angle in Angle's prime, or a version of a current-day Daniel Bryan. If all else fails, I'm sure he could forge some kind of McFly-level father and son bond with Curtis Axel and form a prolific tag team. Number 8, the Brainbusters. Another tag team with the potential to penetrate the space-time continuum and succeed in an era that is not their own is the team of Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson, the Brainbusters. Once 2/5 of the Four Horsemen, yes, we know the math doesn't add up, Blanchard and Anderson were only in the WWF for about a hiccup during the 80s, but their technical prowess and ability to tell an effective story were lauded across their run, and their work outside of the WWE has since gone down in history as being legendary in its own right. If they were to pop up in the late 2010s, the Brainbusters would certainly be old school, as that was their kind of thing even in their prime, but who's to say that this can't get over? The Brainbusters would likely be a team very similar to the Revival, a contemporary team modelled on the likes of the Brainbusters, only taller, and we all know Vince McMahon likes taller. They would be the type of team who could be entrusted with building new talents or propping up an entire division on their back. An always useful commodity, capable of producing matches of the highest standard on pay-per-view or carrying lesser talents to solid encounters on television. They'd be the consummate professionals with a unique presence and style of offense that would make them indispensable to any wrestling company in the modern era. It also sure helped that they had this next guy running around with them at the time. Number 7, Bobby Heenan. If Paul Heyman isn't willing to adopt the moniker of manager because of how he feels he'd never be able to live up to the late great Bobby the Brain Heenan, then imagine just how bloody great this guy would be on WWE TV in 2018. Take modern day Heyman, add some incomparable levels of fragility and an always underlying sense of humanity, and you'd have Bobby Heenan in the contemporary wrestling scene. It truly is the stuff of dreams. Heenan as a manager, as a TV host, or even as a commentator would be fantastic. As a heel sympathizer, you always wanted fighter to shake your fist at, or even as the leader of his own stable, Heenan would undoubtedly add quality to every part of the show he came into contact with, and his quick tongue and faster brain would undoubtedly be well suited to the live presentation of so many wrestling events nowadays. Even in an industry that isn't necessarily crying out for managers, Heenan would be an undeniably positive influence on the product of any wrestling organization, the WWE included. The scientific formula says so. Number 6, the British Bulldogs. If the Rockers were years ahead of their time, then the British Bulldogs were decades ahead. Remnants from the surge in British wrestling popularity in the 70s and early 80s, Davey Boy Smith and his cousin, the Dynamite Kid, were so extraordinarily talented inside the ring that their matches remain vital lessons on how to perform tag matches to this very day. Their mix of traditional British techniques and an ahead of their time speedy offense was about as modern of a style as you could possibly imagine for the decade, and despite their clear British allegiances, they remained super over babyfaces in the US. Kid in particular brought a style of wrestling to the 80s WWF that was faster and more based on athleticism than the majority of his peers, a facet of the team's overall identity that could be transposed into the modern landscape without any issues. With that in mind, can you imagine how great these guys would be if they were pushed to their physical limits night after night, week after week by talent with similar styles like the teams of today? They would have arguably lasted longer in the contemporary climate too, where drugs aren't as much of an issue and there are less pressures on the talent to bulk up in the same way. Not only would the British Bulldogs be a great tag team in the modern day, but they would arguably be better off in this decade too, a cruel irony to this previously playful game. Number 5, Randy Savage. The Macho Man Randy Savage is a wrestler so synonymous with the 1980s that at first it may be difficult to imagine him wrestling in the current era with the same level of success, but hold that thought for a moment because here are a few counterpoints to that. The first and most major point is that Savage was a phenomenal in-ring talent. In fact, in his prime, he may have been the very best of all time. He was the sort of wrestler that could entertain a crowd while putting on a technical masterpiece, and his work has inspired dozens of high-profile names in the decades since. He was so good that almost every active WWE wrestler considers his WrestleMania match with Ricky Steamboat to still be the very best WrestleMania match of all time, even all these years later. The second point is that Jay Lethal has gotten the gimmick over several times in the past decade or so, and why settle for impression when you can get the real thing? Joking aside, Savage would be an unmissable part of any WWE show in the current age, and without a doubt the sort of talent who could step up outside of Vince's company and do fantastic business. Savage versus Omega, Savage versus Daniel Bryan are matches that we can only dream about seeing, but are proof as to how far ahead of his time he was in the ring and how well suited he'd be to the contemporary wrestling scene. Number 4, Rick Rude. Talk about ahead of their time, Rick Rude was just that. Sure, he looked about as 80s as you could imagine, but the gimmick of having different opponents, cities, or versions of himself sprayed onto his tights was an act of genius that separated him from the other attractive, muscular heels of the day, and his ability to come across as the most entitled, arrogant, bigoted douche in the world is without a doubt something that would still get over in the modern day as a top heel persona. In the age of PG, it's tough to see Rude getting away with all he got away with in the 80s and 90s, but say he moved into the indies. He could have a heck of a feud with Joey Ryan right off the bat, imagine the penis-related goodness that would come of that, and if he did end up in the WWE, there'd be plenty of different ways for him to get over his arrogance without necessarily using women as objects like was once the norm in the wrestling business. Take Mr. Rude's body, his ability to garner heat, and those excellent tights, put them in a ring in 2018 and you will have a star guaranteed. Number 3, Jake Roberts. When Jake Roberts spoke, people listened. And it wasn't just because he was a crazed psychopath wearing a python around his neck. The man known somewhat affectionately as the Snake would probably have Peter to answer for if he was to transfer the full gimmick over into the modern era. But even if you were to leave the Snake at home, Roberts would still be a charismatic presence on WWE TV or the biggest of indie shows. He was a guy who always just had it, that indefinable quality that makes people want to take notice. He could grab a microphone as a more lean and less cleanly kept character in the midst of a super tanned, larger-than-life late 80s WWF and still have everybody on the edge of their seats. In missing the Snake, he'd surely be missing a large part of his 80s identity, but this iconic wrestler has more than enough to make up for it, including one of the deadliest finishers in the history of the game, the DDT. Bring it back. Roberts was known as being one of the most intelligent wrestling minds in the business during his prime, and given how well suited his promo delivery, physical appearance, and characterization are to the modern game, I'm willing to bet that his great mind mind would be of great use too. Number 2, Ricky Steamboat. If there was any wrestler from the 1980s whose in-ring style was most suited to the modern day, it would be Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. This technically magnificent wrestler, who always had an adept sense of when to pull out big spots or quick, exciting maneuvers, was an inspiration for many of the current generation growing up, and certainly one of the major North American wrestling style game changers of the era, paving the way for 90s cruiserweights like Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Rey Mysterio, as well as the evolved styles of Chris Jericho and CM Punk who followed. Steamboat was so good that we even got a glimpse of it some 20 years after his in-ring retirement at WrestleMania 25, when he outperformed Roddy Piper, Jimmy Snuka, and arguably even Ric Flair in opposition to Chris Jericho, hitting some trademarked arm drags and top turnbuckle moves at a speed akin to his glory days, using a style and moveset so modern and still exciting that it afforded us a glimpse as to how phenomenal and in his prime Steamboat would be on the contemporary wrestling scene. His gimmick wasn't so absurd that it would need drastically changing, and he had the sort of body that would easily rival some of the best bodies in modern day WWE, but it's for his in-ring talent that he'd be such a huge contemporary star. Can you imagine Steamboat versus Rollins, Steamboat versus AJ Styles, or even Steamboat versus Kevin Owens? Take all of my money. Number 1, Rowdy Roddy Piper. Even years after his death, the immortal and timeless persona that was the Rowdy One remains present and relevant. He was an 80s star undersized for the era, but one who made it to the very top of the mountain anyway. Why? Because he could. Piper had the sort of mouth that could rival Stone Cold Steve Austin, that could rival John Cena, that could rival CM Punk. He was the sort of egomaniac that you loved to boo every time you saw that wry smirk grow across his face. Dastardly deeds aside, he was an ingenious performer whose levels of performance were not only great in terms of wrestling from the 80s, but in terms of wrestling as a whole. Perhaps even more than that, he was so charismatic and believable in his performances that he became, for a short while at least, a Hollywood star, starring in arguably the greatest movie any wrestler has ever starred in, They Live. Even beyond being diagnosed with cancer and approaching his 60s, Piper could grab an audience by the balls and do with them what he pleased. And despite being undersized and a little over the hill, he forever remained believable as somebody who could kick your ass in more creative ways than you could ever imagine. Say you took this 80s wrestler in particular, sat him next to Marty McFly in the DeLorean, and drove him into the present day, he'd be a main event draw the likes of which we would never forget. Whether acting as an out-and-out heel or an anti-hero like a CM Punk, Piper would be the sort of guy people switched on Raw or SmackDown to see. He'd be the type of talent who sold out arenas based on one soundbite. He'd be a multi-time world champion and an icon of his age. He'd truly be the biggest of all the 80s stars. So that's our list. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and you can follow me on Twitter here. If you enjoy what we do here at Cultaholic, you can pledge to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/Cultaholic. And most importantly, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us.